Yorkshire Sculpture Park. And so on behalf of Yorkshire Sculpture Park, it's welcome back really to this very special place. For all of us in all our hearts and minds, we love this space. And we all share in the history of this layered landscape, which has been energised by people since the 11th century, so it does have something very special. And we share this sense of place, albeit a changing space at the moment. And as the current custodians of the archive, which is a unique and fascinating repository of material relating to the history of arts education in the UK and elsewhere, we are delighted to be part of this Bretton Alumni Reunion event. And it's apt and fitting to be inaugurating this as the National Arts Education Archive annual lecture. Today you, in the presence of Professor Dr. John Taylor, who was the principal of Bretton Hall College between 1981 to 93, something like that, and was instrumental in the building of the Lawrence Batley Centre in 1989 to house these wonderful collections in appropriate facilities. I think they've been in the attic somewhere at Bretton Hall, probably you know better than I do. And so I would like to thank Professor Taylor for his ongoing support for the archive. And I'd like to thank Dr. David Hill, who was Emeritus Professor at Bretton Hall and Leeds University, for agreeing to deliver this first lecture, The Bretton Marbles. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for attending this inaugural lecture. It's great to have a room full of people. Following the lecture and the questions, we'd like to invite you back down to the archive to visit the exhibition that we've got on at the moment called Treasures Revealed, which is a celebratory exhibition for the anniversary of 40 years of Yorkshire Sculpture Park. So Professor Taylor would like to come up and introduce Dr. Hill. Thank you.
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to see so many familiar faces. It's first my pleasant job to say thank you not just to Anna, but Leonard Bartle, Tony Denton, Tony Chisholm, because they're the people behind the archive suggestion that we have this annual lecture. Thank you to them. One of the great joys of old age is Mark Twain probably reminded you all. The older we get, the better we remember things, whether they happen or not. And I remember approaching David when, way back in, I think it was 82, he was interviewed alongside a good many others. But his presentation was outstanding because it was the very best of Bretton Hall. All the things that I think about Bretton Hall that are good. Fun, humour, delight. And you will forgive me just one anecdote. On my first day to Bretton, because I had a London job beforehand, I arrived in the office at 8, and of course no one was there. So I popped down to the security office, and some of you will know the night security man was Bill Carter. Lovely, taciturn man, and he said, who are you? So I said, well, I'm the new principal. So he shook my hand, and he said, well, I hand in my night security report every night at the end of a 12-hour shift, 8 to 8. There's no one ever here, but may I hand it to you? So I said, of course, I'd be delighted to read it. So off he went, and I read this report, and it was copper plate writing, wonderful. And that night, I had the good fortune to read this report firsthand, but he found a little yellow Mini outside the media centre. And the windows were all steamed up. you're way ahead of me. And he said, I thought it was a little odd. He said, but the windows weren't steamed up. And it was rocky. So this report went on. He knocked on the driver's side window, and eventually it was lowered. And there in copper plate it said there were two people, a young boy and a young girl, completely naked. So he said, I immediately said to him, and what do you think you're doing? And I shall modify the language a little bit, because the young man said, what does it effing look like? And I thought that summarised all that was best about Bretton. Knowing David since way back in '82, not only a distinguished academic career, unique in many ways because he held two professorships at the University of Leeds. One, the Harwood Professor in Fine Art, very distinguished in itself, but also a professorship in the history of art. And some of you will know the distinctive exhibitions he's curated, the wonderful books that he's managed to produce, and of course, an international expert on Turner. So when Anna and the team asked me if I'd make suggestions for this annual lecture, the first thought that came to my mind, I wondered if I could persuade David to do this talk. And of course, he gladly agreed. And there was no real thought about the topic because the history of the marbles, many people didn't know too much about them. And in fact, when I started to discover the real value of the marbles, we had to keep it under wraps in case someone did what they did with Elizabeth Frink and the Hepworths. Sculpture walks and even heavy objects tend to walk. So it's with considerable pleasure now I introduce David to enlighten us a little more about the Bretton marbles. David here.
Very intimidating. Talking to a room full of people who know a lot more about Bretton Hall than I do. This is the one thing I can say that I've got a little purchase on in my time here. When John appointed me in 1982, it was also an equal embarrassment and exposure of my ignorance. Appointed as lecturer in history of art to the then nascent art and design degree courses here. Discovered that I knew a lot about Turner, but knew nothing about the rest of the history of art. Spent about 10 years lecturing on Turner and this, Turner and that, and the other thing. I had a philosophy that you could actually teach the entire history of art from things within a 25-mile radius, which actually finally let the penny drop regarding these two things. I've got a lot of slides, so I'm going to crack on through them at something of a pace. I've also got a new watch. It's a Fitbit. You can't see any, well, it's daughter's present. You can tell her about what she thinks I need in terms of health guidance at this advanced age. But you can't see, it doesn't have any numbers on it. You have to press all kinds of buttons. So will somebody shout out after I've done about half an hour so that I don't overrun inadvertently or out of over-enthusiasm for this. Anyway, my story concerns two objects. Garden ornaments, as I thought. And I guess all of them you'll know all of them through your time here at Bretton. And it's a story of important things. They turned out to be classical, Greek and ancient, and hidden in plain sight. And hidden in plain sight at least since 1961 when Derek Lindstrom situated them in the situation that I knew them. And I must have walked past them every day for good 10 years. It was 93 by the time that the penny finally dropped, without any real inkling of what they were. My previous job, actually, before I came to Bretton, was as archivist at Temple Newsam House in Leeds. So I knew something about landscape, gardens, and classical furniture, and I thought that these just fitted somewhere into that category. And indeed, they didn't really advertise themselves as being of any special or great importance. This is the first of them, which stood outside at the bottom of the drive. The mansion's just behind the drive there. These are Derek Lindstrom's photographs from the archive of the University of York website. I'm not quite sure what date they are, but they certainly remind me of my time here, so they might have been taken in the 70s or very late 70s, just before I arrived. But there's the, what might call, plant pot for until we discover a little more about it. And there's one view of it, and here's another. And it served time in the summer as a very splendid plant pot, planted up here with a variety of summer flowers, and in the winter as a litter bin. So it wasn't calculated in its presentation to alert us to its significance, but it did indeed turn out to be of really very great importance when the truth finally came out. And the other object was this, which stood outside the entrance to the refectory and was sometime in use as an ashtray. It had a very nice little niche carved into the top of it, which you could stow your cigarettes out in as you went into the refectory. And sometimes as a plinth for students in fancy dress posing in various states of dress and undress, actually, at college balls and the like, prelude to further activities in cars, steamed up cars, about which I know nothing. And I thought, actually, for all the world, that this looked like it was made out of cast concrete. So never really thought very much more about it, except that various students that I was encouraging, following this philosophy of studying the entire history of art in a 25-mile radius, had looked at them and thought that they could, they were the beginnings of making equations with classical motifs and classical history in various ways. But the fact that they were actually antique never occurred to any of us until one day, 1992, I was in Leeds Museum looking for objects to illustrate lectures, to pursue my philosophy, and found myself staring at this thinking, that looks familiar. This was part of the Gott collection in Leeds Museum and still exhibited at Leeds. But when I started to read the label, it was written up in an old catalogue, 1890 this is, I discovered that it was a circular altar of white marble, and it came from the island of Delos, and it dated from about 200 BC. Crikey, I thought. Well, this is, our altar was 3 times the size and in considerable better state of preservation. You just see the good side of it here. The far side of it is completely broken away in the Leeds example. But I thought, maybe if the altar's Greek, then what is that, which is a far finer thing, and has figures on it, and was the quality of the carving was altogether better. I'd written to Peter Breers, the director of Leeds Museums, when I realised the connection between the altar and that at Leeds, to alert him to these things, and he'd been, and it was only really after a few months, and really, I thought I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing here, or thinking I was seeing here, in terms of these antiquities and their potential importance. So I got in touch with him again and alerted John to my suspicions. And 2 days later, Peter Breers rang me up and said, "You'd better sit down," because he, in the meantime, had been in touch with the British Museum. And Susan Walker, who was Director of Antiquities at the British Museum, had identified, realised exactly what it was. And she said, "You realise that scholars have been looking for this thing for about the last 180 years. And that it's famous and it's got a name. It's called the Corinthian Pewtail being a wellhead. And she sent me a couple of articles explaining its importance. The most important scholar of Greek antiquities in the 19th century was this chap, Adolf Michaelis, and he made a complete inventory of things, classical sculpture, in public and private collections in Britain at that time, and published a series of articles, this is the first of them, in 1882, in which he gives some account of it. So it's talking about Lord Guildford, who was president of the Dilettante Society, and he'd been in Greece and he'd seen things. Amongst them, as you can see at the bottom of this passage, a celebrated pewtail with reliefs in a fine archaic style, which Edward Dodwell, well, I'll come to in a minute, had seen in Corinth, still used as the mouth of a well, but turned the wrong side upwards, later brought safely to Zante. Guildford bought them in 1810, shipped them to London in 1813, and kept them all at his London house, 23 St James's Place, which was sold at his death in 1827 to Thomas Wentworth Beaumont, and hence they found their way to Bretton, but they were lost sight of at that point, and Michaelis had no idea where it had gone. A couple of years later, 1885, he wrote it up in much greater detail and gives a lot of detail about the references that he knew to it. Gives more detail about where it was first, at the beginning of the century, in 1805 to be precise. It was in the possession of a certain notara. They were actually a notable family in Corinth. And he'd got this marble being and pierced at the centre and sculpted with 10 human figures from a Turk in whose house it served as the mouth of a well, etc. It was in his garden. The Notara's house was served as a hotel for visiting tourists, travellers and English gentlemen. So all of those who passed through his house saw this. And Dodwell drew it, made casts of it, and a succession of other scholars saw it in the subsequent years before it was removed to London. So it was probably, in his estimation, one of the best examples of classical statuary lost but yet to be discovered. This conviction, he's talking about the subject, cannot but strengthen our wish that the lost original itself might be rediscovered and allow a fuller and final examination. The question is, where can the original lie hid? He finishes his article by saying, it's well worth the common efforts of all the English, and especially the London readers of this journal, the Journal of Hellenic Studies, to search out after such a capital monument as the Corinthian Pewtail. Who will succeed in finding it out? His Greek my Greek is not very good. However, it does translate as he rewarded shall be. And indeed, although not financially by any means, I have been rewarded with a whole series of interesting research trips to Greece on the excuse of furthering my knowledge of these objects. As you will see, many of them funded by the Bretton Hall Research Fund, which, it may not be a coincidence, I was the proprietor of for several years before my removal to the university in 2001. The results of these I'll show you something of. But here is an 1805, Dodwell saw it in 1805. He was travelling with an artist called Simone Pomodori. And he made watercolours and drawings of the wellhead. And they survived that. This is now in the British Museum. It's actually only recently acquired. But when Dodwell published his tour in 1819, Pomodori's drawings formed a basis of a series of etchings of the really detailed etches, and not quite perfectly accurate by reference to the originals. Now we can see them. But the standard reference, very high quality etchings as well, there was the standard reference for scholarship until the realisation that it was here at Bretton all along in '93. As it happens, John was just retiring in that year. So he passed it to his successor, Gordon Bell, who came into the college in the autumn to discover that he had a bit of a problem, apart from the need to mend the roof and things of that sort at Bretton Hall. There was the issue about what to do with these things. Now we realised what they were. I'll come back to that. But just finally, in terms of what was known about them, the British Museum all along had a cast. A cast was made, a clay impress was made in 1805 and shipped to Athens. And Lord Aberdeen, who was founder of the Athenian Society, brought the cast to London and gave it to the British Museum. It turns out there are other versions of the other casts were made, and fragments of it survive in different places. There are some apparently in the US, which I've just learned today, and there are some, I think, in Glasgow, but I'll look up that reference again in exchange for the news about the American versions of the cast. Here you can see them upside down in the cast store in Earl's Court. Very grubby, but they did certainly give some idea to scholars throughout the lost period of the potential importance of this when it was rediscovered. Dodwell and all the early scholars, Michaelis included, thought it was classical, thought that it must date to the 4th or 3rd century BC. Modern scholarship differs. Who am I to say? But actually I think I differ from modern scholarship a little. I think it's actually the question of its date and the question of its importance even is still somewhat an open question. Let me give you a little context and a little flavour of the researches that I've done. So we know that the altar came from the Greek island of Delos, which is in the Aegean. I don't know if you can make it out in this slide. It's here in the middle of the Aegean. Delos was created by the gods as the birthplace of Apollo, and his sister Artemis. So it was one of the most important and celebrated sacred sites in the ancient Greek world, and a massive temple complex grew up. I won't go into tremendous detail, but I can show you a little something of the site as it is today, at least as it was in 1997, I think, when I went there and took these photographs. So here we're looking down upon the port from above. Here's another slide of the whole city, and it was a considerable city with a massive theatre and a city of perhaps 10,000 souls at its height, and a whole series of temple complexes, and receiving tens of thousands of pilgrims and visitors every year. Of course, Greece is an earthquake zone, so virtually all these places have been shattered into rubble over the centuries. But the very fabric of the altar was itself sacred. It was made of this stone, so that was created actually to receive Apollo's birth. So it was very highly prized and extremely jealously regulated. And altars and artifacts made from this stone worshipped as sacred objects all over the Greek and Hellenistic world. And here, by the port, are a whole parade of altars and artifacts lined up on the quayside, awaiting shipment to their various destinations. And no doubt our altar took its place in that queue at some stage, exported presumably from Corinth, from Delos, presumably about the same time as the Pew Tale, and bought by Lord Guildford in the same collecting spree about 1810. God knows what it thought about being transmigrated from the azure skies of the Aegean to the greyer skies of West Yorkshire, but there it did reside for many a year before being removed. We'll come back to that later on. And the Pew Tale, wellhead, Greek for wellhead, I'm not entirely convinced, nor indeed are the classical scholars who really know about this stuff, that it was actually made as a wellhead. Certainly Susan Walker said to me that she thought it had been drilled out later to become a wellhead, and that it was probably a statue base when it was originally made. But we do know it's made of Pentelic marble, and that was quarried in Athens. And we do know that the style of it is Athenian or Attic in general, and it may well be that the sculptor of it was himself an Athenian, or herself perhaps. Corinth is here, and on the isthmus between the Corinthian Gulf and the Saronic Gulf. And Corinth had an immense importance as an antique centre, being more or less the node of trade between all of the western Mediterranean. It lets out into the Ionic Sea and the Adriatic, Italy, France, Sicily, and North Africa to the west, and to the Aegean and to the Middle East, Turkey and the Holy Land and North Africa, Egypt, to the east. So it was a major centre. And where the Pew Tale found its place in Corinth is unknown. Here's a slightly detailed map of the city and a view of the Temple of Apollo, which is the main monument in the ancient city of Corinth, and a view from the top of the Acro Corinth, the mountain behind it in that last slide, down on the old city, and indeed the new port in the far distance. But the temple and the ancient city are here in the bottom left-hand corner of that slide, and you can see it in slightly greater detail in this slide here. You can just make out the Temple of Apollo there in this slide, and a whole massive complex. The town itself was razed to the ground in a massive earthquake in 1853. So most of the buildings that you can see around the temple complex are actually modern. And we've no idea where in this whole complex the Pew Tale stood, or indeed where the house of Notaras was. And there is a great deal of work, I think, to do in trying to establish some kind of archaeological context for that monument. There's a gap. I mean, Corinth prospered particularly between the 4th century BC and the 2nd. It was destroyed entirely by the Romans in 156 BC, and then refounded by Julius Caesar in 44 BC. We'll come back to that refounding because it's relevant to current understanding of the date of the Pew Tale. But these are the Roman baths. Corinth was famed above all for its crystal springs and its water and its fountains. And it may well be that the Pew Tale formed some part of those in history. But context we have not. But one idea that did occur to me, which actually occurred to me from these slides which I took in '93, was that the relief of the figures is so shallow that, I mean, it's literally only 3 or 4 millimetres, that you can really only see the detail in raking light, as in that photograph. Because when the light's flat upon any of these figures, you can barely see the relief and the detail at all. It's only when the sun shines across, I think. And it struck me as being important somehow that it was round, that it was a circular relief, and that the sun does move round it. And I imagine, although it's pure speculation, that it stood originally in a round temple, a tholos, as they're called, and the figures successively were revealed as the sun moved around during the day, from sunrise to sunset. We'll come back to that as an idea in just a minute. Because there are many comparative works. The style is generally described by classical scholars as being archaistic. That is, it refers back to the archaic, that is the 6th century BC or the early 5th, and is a style that you'll see commonly on red figure pottery. But it's a later emulation of that old style. And it's certainly that. It's much more sophisticated than those archaic styles in its carving. And it was very common and popular in the early Augustan period. That is the late 1st century BC. And it's there that it's dated on the basis of a really important, which is the one I want to show you, recent discovery made after we'd realised what the pewtail and the altar were, at a place called Nicopolis, which is on the western coast of Greece here. And Nicopolis was founded by Augustus in 31 BC to mark his victory over the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And there's now a lovely museum at Nicopolis, a modern museum. This particular comparative piece here, which has exactly the same frieze of 10 figures on it, was only discovered in 1999. It was unearthed at the end, actually, of a long, careful excavation of a victory monument that Augustus raised in 31 BC, well, between 31 and 28 BC, to mark his victory over Mark Antony. So here's a slide of it, and you can see the similarity of those figures. But actually, rather, the similarity is close. It's by far and away the closest comparison. It's the same, it's exactly the same iconographic scheme. Before we see that, here's just a slide of the side. On the hill overlooking the ancient city is down at the bottom here. We're looking at the Gulf of Actium here. Mark Antony's fleet, Cleopatra's fleet, was holed up in the Gulf. Augustus's fleet came down the Adriatic here to the right and lured them out finally and destroyed them when they did finally emerge. So, overlooking that whole side of the victory, Augustus constructed this huge altar place, which was surrounded by a colonnaded arcade here, and the altar, the pewtail, statue base that Nicopolis Museum was found here by the side of the ancient altar. So, what can this connection be? Obviously, it's the same figures. The one of these artists has seen the other's work. But let's look at the comparison a little more closely. Here's what I call the final figure. We'll see the whole scheme just in a minute. but it's a figure of Aphrodite, and it's a really wonderful piece of sensual carving, in almost equivalent to the finest of Greek carving of the classical period. I'm thinking of the Parthenon sculptures, particularly of the late 5th century. Here it is side by side with the same figure on the Nicopolis sculpture. They really just don't bear any comparison whatsoever in terms of quality. The composition is much more open, much more elegant. There's a real sense of movement. There's a sense of the transparency of the material that covers the limbs of the figure. The carving is much finer altogether. The relief in the Nicopolis Museum is much greater. It's more like over a centimetre or more. It's 3 times the relief of the... And the whole thing is, comparatively, to my eyes, lumpen and less refined or elegant, much less sophisticated production altogether, although in better conditions, so producing some of the details back is very useful. Here's another one, just another one of the figures. Here's the figure of Artemis, or Diana, the chaste huntress, sister of Apollo, from the Bretton Hall pew tale. Look at them. And this was as it was found before restoration. How wonderful the detailing of the pleating of the skirt is, how tenderly she holds the paw of her hind, how excellently knowledgeable of Greek bows is this sculptor, and how ignorant of them is this one. But this, by modern scholarship, has been taken as the definitive evidence, since we know it's unusual actually for an archaeological remains such as this, an ancient work of art such as, to be so precisely datable as the Nicopolis base. I mean, we know that this was made between 31 and 28 BC, period. No doubt about that. But what must this be? I mean, it rather seems to me, just on the basis of the imitation, that this must have been well known. This is the type piece from which that was copied, and may well have been of considerable antiquity when the Nicopolis piece was made. And certainly everywhere you look in the fine detail, insufficient time to go into that at all today, but when you look at the fine detail of the costumes, of the attributes, of the things that they carry, Apollo's lyre, for example, then you realise immediately that this sculptor knew exactly what those ancient things were like. He was Greek, and he was steeped in Greek history and contemporary matters. This artist had no idea. He was just looking at a pre-existing formula and copying it and imitating it as best he could. So just to close the story with their disposal and discovery, it left us with a real problem, as John intimated at the beginning, that all of a sudden these were a liability to us. The British Museum told us that it weighed about 1.3 tonnes. Basically 4 men in a flat-back truck could have that away in about 15 minutes. So what are we to do with them, we said? So just leave it where it is and trust that nobody knows. And at that time, I think about 5 people in the whole world knew what it was. Until we can actually get somebody up to look at it and see about moving it, because if you try and pick it up, it'll just fall apart and be completely ruined. So a stone conservator came and examined it and supervised the removal of it to Michael Eastham's studio. It was the leading antique stone conservator in Britain at that time. And the Henry Moore Institute Edinburgh Foundation funded its restoration in 1995. But what to do with them? Because there was nowhere in the college without instituting, inordinate security that we could put them on public display. But of course, Peter Murray, just at that time, was thinking about this place and there's this new visitor centre. I talked to him then and he said, well, I'm sure we'll be able to find room for them somewhere when it's finished. And that seems such a good idea. They would remain on site, there'd be natural security here, the public would view them, but they would still be in their authentic and original historical Bretton Hall context. So they were put away. At the back of the boiler room, as it happens, which I can tell you now, but which was the closest guarded secret in the world for about 5 years, waiting for the visitor centre to be finished and them to be put on public display. But things overtook us, events overtook us, that is, merger with the university. And this is where my story starts to get a bit critical, really. HEFC, God bless it, the Higher Education Funding Council, where are they now? Who are they? Who were they? When are they going to take some responsibility for what they caused meddling with Bretton Hall back in '99? But they said, well, pretty much if it's not nailed down and it's not essential to the university taking over the place, then it's going to be sold. And those things are worth some serious money, they're going to be sold. So they went very quiet indeed. We couldn't do anything with them, and it was only after some kind of strategy. I mean, it was obvious that they couldn't just be, well, at least the Pewtail, which was such importance, couldn't be put on the open market. And there was a plan that, well, if it was to go anywhere, it really ought to go to the British Museum. Fair enough. So a plan was concocted. And it was 2001, as the university reporter, by the time that the news was breached to the press. And the following year, the Pewtail was sold. So the altar was sold at Christie's for £56,000. Actually, I only just discovered about a year ago that it hasn't disappeared entirely. It's gone to Waddesdon Manor National Trust. It's part of the Rothschild collection. The Rothschilds bought it. And they actually have several others. They're probably the country's best collection of Delian altars. It joins a group of at least 6 or 7 others. So that's okay. That's a destination. The story of the disposal of the Pewtail is a little stranger. I'm not making any accusations here, but the sale was handled by these people. I don't know who they are, Oliver Ford and Brendan Lynch. This is from their website. They're very proud of being agents in its disposal to the British Museum. But by some device or ruse, they reckoned it had been sold to a foreign buyer for about £300,000. So, whether is perhaps a better word, a deference of export licence was applied for. This is the Arts Minister's press release. It's still on the website, dated 19th of November 2002. That the price was, that an application for export had come in, and the price of $294,000 had been agreed to give a chance for a British museum to acquire it. And so the Art Fund stepped in with a sum of just over $102,000, I think, and enabled the British Museum to buy it. I have to be careful what I'm saying here, but I wonder whether the Art Fund know that they spent $102,000 transferring an object from one public body to another in Britain. Anyway, I do not know what the answers to these questions are, but it doesn't seem to quite add up, except, I suppose, to, under the circumstances, a reasonable outcome in that it did find its way to the British Museum. Although, as an art historian, I have to say, I'm not the greatest fan of museum collections like this. I really do much prefer to see things in their original and historic context. I used to teach religiously that context is really half the work. And if you change it, then you change the way the work's seen, what the work means, what it relates to, and so on. And actually, the truth is that it's hardly ever on display. It's in the basement room of the British Museum, which was open to the public in the early years of its acquisition, but which has been largely off display ever since. So, what might we say? Final 2 slides. Just to go back to the subject. So here's all 10 of those figures. We've got a procession, a lopsided procession as it happens, of 7 figures led by Apollo with his light, followed by Artemis, his sister, the chaste, unchastened goddess of nature, Latona, their mother, she who was banished to Delos to give birth to the twins, followed by Hermes, messenger and god of music, amongst other things, followed by the 3 Graces, Aphrodite and her 2 daughters. And that's a particularly ancient Greek formulation, by the way, of the Graces, Aphrodite and 2 daughters rather than 3, as is commonly in Roman mythology. Anyway, they process from right to left, and they meet 3 other figures. Athena, leading this little procession, followed by Heracles with his club, followed by Hera, the veiled, mysterious wife of Zeus, much vengeful and machinating, and also goddess of war. So there have been all sorts of suggestions as to what the general subject of this frieze might be. But I have one different, I think, to all the others. Really, what have you got here? You've got a troupe of figures here who represent quintessentially the arts of peace. And you've got 3 figures, the warlike Athena with her war helmet, Heracles with his club, and Hera with her veil, mysteries, and vengeful and wrathful nature, meeting. I imagine that the context was probably diplomatic, in that here's the titular god of Athens, and here's the titular god of Corinth. The thing was made in Athens, or at least made of Athenian stone that found its way to Corinth, so it seems to be some kind of diplomatic gift, perhaps. But it seems generally to represent the triumph of the arts over those of war. What more fitting emblem could there possibly have been for the mission of Bretton Hall College, dedicated to education and the arts? An epitaph, perhaps, to the demise of a project which we all shared in and loved, but a reminder, if ever one was needed, of the constant need for vigilance, nay, action, to protect that mission of the arts of peace over those of war, especially against the spirit of, let's say, political cupidity in the merger, and mistaken, actually, if truth be told, and positive venality that caused that mission to finally founder. Thank you.
That was quite magnificent. I think you've all shown how much you appreciate what David has said. On reflection, it makes me think that I didn't make too bad a decision way back in '82. It wasn't a bad decision when Anna and colleagues put me on the spot and said, who's going to give this first lecture? I was delighted that David agreed. Wonderfully thorough. I don't wish to steal any of your thunder or get into the wonderful business of alibi management. But when we first knew the potential value of both objects, we could only do two things. And you will now realise how pathetic it was to be a principal under the hammer. Number one, we managed to slide one object underneath the canopy. So the elements were not totally eroding the model. The second problem was we thought that at least one of them could go in the entrance hall. But we employed several engineers who told us the danger was that if you managed to get it into the main entrance hall, then it would descend into the basement rather quickly. and you could see how marvellous the headline would be. Architect principal sinks on the weight of this wonderful artifact. And it was a bit the same when the family of man disappeared off the hillside. Alan Burness was the first person to phone me that morning. And he said, John, what were you doing? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, to let that lot be stolen under your very eyes. And I said, well, Alan, I don't actually sleep next to the family now. But then he said, but it's the best thing you've ever done. So I said, you would have to be a bit more explicit there. He said, it'd be worth it in publicity alone. And sure enough, 3 months later, when I was giving a lecture at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, and the taxi driver said to me, where did you come from? And the safest bet I've always found is to say London. So he said, is it really London? So I said, no, it's in the north. So eventually he said, where precisely? So I said, Bretton Hall. And he says, quick as a flash, a Canadian taxi driver, you've had all your sculpture stolen. And in terms of putting Bretton Hall on the map, that is one way of doing it. What David has done this afternoon, I think, to all architects, is given us not only a wonderful history and the background, but it's, again, the points I made to start with, I think. The best about Bretton is the humour, the delight, and the fun. Thank you, David. Wonderful.